December 20 will see the induction of two brand new cards to Marvel Snap. One will be Sentry and the other will be Darkhawk. In this video, we're going to focus entirely on Sentry. I'll have another video out about Darkhawk in a similar format later in the week. This is my quote-unquote pre-release review, so I'm going to be making a lot of assumptions about what the metagame will look like, how Sentry will modify the metagame, if at all, and what Sentry decks will probably look like, assuming the card does see any play. So, first of all, let's go over the card. Sentry is a 4/8, so that's good stats, with the effect cannot be played on the right location. On reveal, add a -8 power The Void to the right location. So what are some good things about this card? First of all, 4/8 is a fantastic stat line. We do have some other 4/8s in the game, but they have significant downsides. Crossbones has to be winning the location to be played there. That downside makes the card very inflexible, and it's a downside that doesn't give the players much room for creative deck building to mitigate that downside. Drax is a 4/4 that is sometimes a 4/8 because its downside requires that you predict where the opponent's going to play, and not only do you need to predict where the opponent's going to play, you're going to need to want to put power into that location. So again, a relatively inflexible card. There are some creative deck building options you can explore with Drax. Galactus could potentially run Drax. There are other ways to limit the locations your opponent's going to play at. Maybe even like a Spider-Man deck would want to run some Guardian stuff, but the on-reveal effect is definitely a downside. Of all of the 4/8 cards in the game, I'd say Sentry actually has the best effect because the player can mitigate his downside. The only non-flexible aspect of the card is that you can't actually play himself in the right location, but that's fine because I think honestly, most of the time, we're not going to want to do that anyway. Another aspect of the card to keep in mind is that the Void will always be summoned in the right location instead of another location. There are going to be games where the right location can't be interacted with. If we get something like Death's Domain or Sanctum Sanctorum, it's going to be hard for us to take advantage of the Void that's being summoned or to mitigate the downside of the Void being summoned. So we're sometimes just going to actually just give up the lane entirely because we got a bad location spawn on the right side, which isn't great, but it's something to keep in mind about the card. Next, we'll talk a little bit about some of the synergies and strategies that you can enable with the Sentry. Each of the destruction activation effects have synergy with the Sentry because we can just destroy the Void, with the exception of Venom, because obviously Venom consumes the -8 stats anyway, so that means we would have Deathlock and Carnage, both having pretty strong interactions with the Void. The Destroyer also sort of has synergy, though I don't think that's worth building around. It's just worth keeping in mind that it does indeed actually have some synergy with Destroyer. Another synergistic card to keep in mind is Viper. Viper is actually an 11-point swing on the right location if you play her alongside the Void, because you're giving the opponent -8 power, and of course you're adding 3 power to that location. That's pretty fantastic when you also have a 4/8 that you're generating from Sentry. That's not too bad at all. Sentry is also not a bad target for Zero. He's not exactly a reason you would want to build the Zero deck, but if you are building a Zero deck, Sentry is not a bad inclusion. You'll still have to deal with the restriction of not being able to play the card on the right side because that part of the effect isn't nullified until the card comes in play, similar to how you can't Zero an Infinite. But playing Zero on Sentry will, of course, nullify his on-reveal effect, meaning you will not get the 0/8. Professor X also might be an idea for Sentry because we can try to win the right location early on with big powerful cards, including cards like Sunspot, which can add power to the location later, and then we can Professor X the location and use Sentry later on in the game, and that way we never get to play that -8 card, but we've still managed to lock in that right location, and we still get to play our 8 power card, which is pretty powerful for 4 energy. I actually had this video fully edited before I noticed this piece of synergy, but potentially Hela is a good piece of synergy for Sentry because we often want to brick a single location playing Hela anyway underneath like an Invisible Woman. So if we do that on the right location, the Sentry is not going to summon the Void because the Void will have no room to summon. Outside of direct synergy, we can actually pilot our deck in a way that rewards us for playing Sentry. For example, if we were to fill our right location before playing Sentry, Sentry would essentially just be a free 4/8 because there would be no room for the Void to summon in. We can do this a few ways. We can play cheap cards that can either be moved out of the location later, so maybe we run Doctor Strange, which seems a little bit more gimmicky than it needs to be, so we probably just run something like Nightcrawler, or even something like Sunspot that can still add power to the location despite it being a full location. So maybe we do something like really early curve. We can throw in a Sentry in the middle area, and one of the early curve cards would be Sunspot. We completely fill the right location, and then we play Sentry on 4. We skip on turn 5 to add more power over there, and then we play either a big She-Hulk combo or a big Infinite. There are some ideas there to explore with but it's just worth keeping in mind there is a way to pilot the deck without actually having any direct synergy with the Void. You can pilot the deck in such a way that the -8 power is irrelevant to. What about countering Sentry? How do we go about doing that? If you play Cosmo under the same location that the opponent plays the Void, then they're not going to be able to interact with the Void. It's just going to actually be a -8 card that they can't get rid of. They can't destroy it. They can't do anything with that card. It's very likely that they have priority because you're very likely to throw priority when you play Sentry, because it's a net 0 power. You're only developing 8 power with the Sentry and you're developing -8 power with the Void. So again, it's a net 0. So it's very likely that your opponent's developing some power. So they're likely to steal priority from you, which means that Cosmo is more likely to get value in protecting the Void from being vipered or carnaged or something. Here's an example deck list for the Sentry. This is a pretty big disruption list. I used this list to hit Infinite a couple seasons ago. I actually forget what season it was. I think it was the season after Daredevil. Could be wrong. Something like that. Sentry could potentially work really well in this deck list because this deck list is pretty much the only deck list that I've ever had success with Viper. And because we happen to run Viper, Sentry becomes a little bit more appealing because he's significantly more powerful if we're running him in a deck that happens to run Viper. And the deck also already happens to run Carnage. So we can take advantage of the -8 power, or at least we can mitigate the -8 power quite nicely in this deck already. So if I am to pull Sentry for some reason, this is the deck that I'll be running Sentry in. But how powerful do we think Sentry is? What is the verdict? I'll put him at like a 3 out of 5 stars. The card's okay. It certainly enhances disruption strategies, but I don't think it's going to have a dramatic impact on the future of Marvel Snap's competitive metagame, unless we do get some additional disruption support. Of all of the elite cards that we've seen so far, I don't think there's going to be anything that pushes Sentry over the edge. I do think it is worth running Sentry in disruption packages. I just don't think disruption packages are like meta-defining decks or anything like that. With that said, though, you can definitely get away with climbing with a deck like that for sure. You could absolutely climb to Infinite with disruption strategies. Like I said, the deck example that we went over before is a deck that I went to Infinite with. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Those have been my takes on Sentry. Let me know what you think about Sentry. Will you be picking up Sentry? Are you hopeful that you might pull Sentry, or do you not care about Sentry at all? I'll catch you in the next one.